Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some fascinating excerpts from a book called Dhamma Within Reach by Ajahn Nyanamoli Thero.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a good one.
Just skimming through it, it's clear this deep dive is going to get pretty profound. We're talking Buddhist philosophy, how to actually handle suffering, mindfulness, and, the big one, finding liberation.
It's a book that's just packed with wisdom, and it's great because it takes all these ancient teachings and, helps us figure out how to actually apply them to our modern lives.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Right off the bat, it talks about how we're all prey to suffering, and that phrase really hit me. I mean, we all know sadness and anger exist, but Ajahn Nyanamoli really highlights this constant vulnerability we all feel, like we're always kind of on edge.
Yeah, it's like being stuck in a lion's den, right? Never knowing when that lion is going to pounce.
Exactly. It's not just the occasional bad day, it's this underlying feeling of being trapped by our own reactions.
And he's so good at pointing out the difference between just managing suffering, like trying to avoid the lion, and actually uprooting it completely. Most of us, when we're facing a problem, we try to find ways to cope, to kind of manage it, right?
Oh, totally. Like, I'm stressed, so I'll just order takeout and binge watch something. But that's just a temporary fix.
Exactly. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. It doesn't really address the root cause.
And Buddhist practice, as described in this book, isn't about just learning to live with suffering, is it? It's about getting out of that lion's den altogether, right?
Yeah, it's about completely uprooting the possibility of suffering, not just learning to tolerate it. And to illustrate that, he uses this really interesting metaphor of the divine messengers.
Oh, yeah. Can you talk about that a bit more? I was intrigued by that part.
Well, he uses sickness, aging, and death as metaphors for the suffering we all inevitably face. Like, those are the ultimate lions that no one can escape from, no matter how hard we try.
Whoa, that's heavy stuff. No amount of distractions can really shield us from those realities.
Yep, they'll always catch up to us eventually. So if just trying to manage suffering isn't the answer, then what is? How do we go from being prey to actually experiencing liberation?
Yeah, what's the secret?
Well, that's where the Four Noble Truths come in. They're the foundation of Buddhist teachings. The first truth is that suffering exists. The second truth is that suffering has a cause. And that cause, often translated as craving or clinging, is thana.
So it's not the lion itself, it's the fact that we're trapped in the lion's den of our own attachments.
You got it. It's our attachment to things being a certain way, or our aversion to things we find unpleasant. That's what really causes us to suffer.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So to break free, we need to work on this clinging and aversion. But how do we actually do that?
That's where the third and fourth noble truths come in. The truth of the cessation of suffering and the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. The path is the Eightfold Path, and one of its core components is right view.
Right view. Okay, I gotta be honest, that sounds a bit vague. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, right view is about seeing things as they truly are, not getting caught up in our own stories and interpretations. And a big part of that is understanding the motivations behind our actions. Think of it like this. You really want that extra slice of cake, right?
Oh, always.
Right view is about seeing beyond that immediate pleasure and recognizing the potential consequences for your health and well-being. It's about hitting pause and asking yourself, why am I doing this? What's really motivating me?
Wow, that's actually a really helpful example. It's about being honest with ourselves and understanding the why behind our actions.
Yeah, exactly.
And isn't that where mindfulness comes in?
Absolutely. Mindfulness is all about paying attention to the present moment without judgment. By being mindful of our thoughts, feelings, and sensations, we start to see those habitual patterns of craving and aversion.
So we can actually catch ourselves in the act rather than just mindlessly reacting.
Exactly. And when we can see those patterns clearly, we can start to make different choices.
It's like creating space between the impulse and the action, so we can actually respond in a way that's aligned with our values rather than just being driven by cravings.
You got it. Mindfulness gives us the power to respond skillfully instead of just reacting habitually.
Okay, this is all sounding great in theory, but resisting those cravings and aversions isn't always easy. Sometimes those impulses are strong, and it's hard to fight them. That kind of brings us to another key concept from the book, right endurance.
Yeah, and that's where the concept of the middle way is so important. It's not about giving in to every desire, but it's also not about suppressing them completely. It's about finding balance.
So it's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot. There's room for actually feeling our emotions.
Oh, definitely. It's about learning to experience our emotions without getting completely overwhelmed by them. He uses this great analogy. Imagine a tortoise withdrawing into its shell for protection. We can learn to find a similar sense of peace and stability even when we're feeling all sorts of intense emotions.
I love that imagery. It feels like a more sustainable approach to dealing with difficult feelings. It's not about fighting them, but finding a way to coexist with them. And speaking of dealing with emotions, Ajahn Nyanamoli also talks a lot about using the breath as a tool, right?
Yes, he emphasizes the practice of anapanasati, which is mindfulness of breathing. The breath is always there, a natural rhythm we can tune into to help calm and ground the mind.
It's like having this built-in anchor we can always come back to, no matter how chaotic things are feeling.
Precisely. By focusing on the breath, we can create some space between ourselves and those swirling thoughts and emotions.
So we can observe them with a little more clarity and equanimity instead of getting swept away.
Exactly. And that space, that awareness, is where real freedom starts to emerge.
This is all painting such a fascinating picture of what this path to liberation actually looks like. But I'm curious to explore how this applies to specific challenges like anger, depression, and even our relationship with pleasure.
Those are great areas to focus on.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into how these teachings can help us navigate some of the trickier parts of being human. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how Buddhist practice can help us navigate suffering and find true liberation. Now I'm really interested in how these teachings apply to more everyday challenges. Like, how do we actually deal with things like anger and depression?
Yeah, those are big ones. Let's start with anger. Ajahn Nyanamoli suggests this really interesting thought experiment in the book. He says to think back to times when you felt angry and try to see what those experiences had in common. Like, what's the common thread?
So it's not just like, oh, I had a bad day. It's more about really getting to the root of that anger.
Exactly. And what he points to is that anger usually comes from us resisting unpleasant feelings, not from the actual external situation itself.
Oh, interesting. So it's not that the person who cut me off in traffic is making me angry. It's that I'm resisting that feeling of frustration.
You got it. It's that internal resistance, that desire for things to be different than they are, that fuels the fire of anger.
Wow, that's a really powerful insight. I mean, we might have more control over our anger than we realize. But what about when we're dealing with something like depression? I mean, that feels so much heavier, less about some external event.
That's true. Depression can feel incredibly heavy and pervasive. And in those situations, Ajahn Nyanamoli again applies the principles of the middle way. He explains that resisting the unpleasantness of depression actually just makes it worse. It's like struggling in quicksand. The more you fight it, the deeper you sink.
So trying to force ourselves to snap out of it or just pushing it down is actually counterproductive.
Exactly. He says the key is to train the mind to not immediately react, to not get swept away by that feeling of aversion. And he suggests that a really important part of this training is actually through sense restraint.
Wait, sense restraint, what does that have to do with depression?
Well, he's talking about recognizing how constantly bombarding ourselves with stimuli, like through our phones, TV, food, all that stuff, can actually make us more vulnerable to difficult emotional states.
It's like we're constantly adding fuel to the fire, huh?
Yeah, exactly. By practicing sense restraint, we're creating more space for the mind to settle and for deep insights to arise.
So it's about creating stillness, both internally and externally, to allow for healing and clarity.
You got it. And this leads us to another important practice that he discusses in the book, cultivating solitude.
Okay, gotta be honest, solitude kind of freaks me out. It's like the idea of being totally alone with my thoughts and feelings. It feels almost like facing death.
You're not alone in feeling that way. He acknowledges that solitude can be intimidating at first, but he also points out that this fear can actually teach us a lot about ourselves. It can show us how much we rely on external things for comfort and even for our sense of self.
So it's like facing those divine messengers we were talking about earlier. Sickness, aging, death, but on a psychological level.
Exactly. And just like we can learn to face those ultimate realities with grace and acceptance, we can learn to face the reality of our own inner world. And when we do that, when we can accept what is, that's when we start to experience a deep sense of freedom.
It's like we're reclaiming our own power, realizing that we don't have to be constantly plugged in and distracted to feel whole.
Right. And in terms of how to cultivate solitude, he suggests starting small. It doesn't have to be about going off to live in a cave in the Himalayas or anything.
Phew, that's a relief.
Yeah, it could be something as simple as taking a walk in nature without your phone, or spending 10 minutes each morning in quiet contemplation. Or maybe setting aside one evening a week for screen-free time. Small steps like that can make a big difference.
Those are great practical suggestions. It's about creating those pockets of stillness throughout the day to just be present with ourselves. This reminds me of another practice we touched on earlier, mindfulness of death, which I have to admit is something I struggle with a bit.
Understandable, a lot of people do. But Ajahn Nyanamoli is very clear that mindfulness of death isn't about being morbid or focusing on negative stuff. It's about using the awareness of death as a tool to help us live more fully in the present moment.
Okay, but I'm still not sure I understand. How does thinking about death help us live better?
Remember how we talked about tanha or craving being the root of suffering? Well, mindfulness of death helps to loosen the grip of those cravings and attachments.
Oh, I see. Because when we're so focused on our own mortality, everything else seems less important.
Exactly. When we contemplate the fact that everything is impermanent, including our own lives, it can really shift our perspective. Suddenly, that argument with a coworker or the desire for a new car doesn't seem so significant anymore.
It's like gaining a cosmic perspective, realizing that our time here is precious, and we don't want to waste it on things that ultimately don't matter.
Precisely. And that awareness can be incredibly liberating. It can inspire us to actually prioritize the things that are truly meaningful and live with more intention and purpose.
So it's not about dwelling on death, but about using that awareness as fuel to live more fully in the present moment.
You got it. It's about appreciating the preciousness of life and making the most of every breath. Now, all of this is incredibly profound stuff, but I want to be honest, it can also feel a little overwhelming at times. There's so much to practice and remember. It's like, where do we even begin? I get that. It's important to remember that this is a path, a journey, not a destination. And like any journey, we take it one step at a time.
So no pressure to become a perfectly enlightened being overnight.
Not at all. Even the Buddha himself emphasized the importance of gradual training. He often compared this path to taming a wild elephant.
Oh, I love that analogy.
You wouldn't try to wrestle a wild elephant into submission all at once, right? It takes time, patience, and a lot of skillful means.
Makes sense. And speaking of obstacles, we need to talk about those 5 bandits standing between us and peace. The 5 hindrances.
Oh yeah, the 5 hindrances. These are like 5 bandits blocking the path to inner peace. Sensual desire is the charming bandit, tempting you with fleeting pleasures. Lil Will is the angry bandit who wants to fight everyone and everything. Sloth and torpor are the lazy bandits who can't be bothered to move. Restlessness and anxiety are the nervous bandits who can't sit still. And doubt is the skeptical bandit who questions everything.
Okay, that's a much more vivid way to think about them. But how do we actually deal with these bandits? Do we try to fight them head on?
Well, that's where the practice of calming the mind, also known as samatha, comes in. And Ajahn Nyanamoli emphasizes that this isn't just about relaxing or trying to escape from unpleasant thoughts.
So it's not just about creating this bliss bubble where nothing bothers us.
Exactly, right? Meditation, practice alongside virtue and sense restraint, is about cultivating a mind that is both calm and stable, even amidst life's challenges.
So it's about developing that inner strength to face those bandits head on without being thrown off balance.
Precisely. And one of the most powerful tools we have for calming the mind is, again, the breath. Through the practice of anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, we cultivate a sense of groundedness and clarity.
It sounds like breathwork is a really essential part of this whole path. It's like the thread that weaves together all these different practices and insights. This has been so insightful. We've covered so much ground already, but I think we need one more part to really unpack how all of this comes together and what it actually means to walk this path towards liberation.
I agree. There's still a lot to explore.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been having a pretty intense conversation about some pretty profound concepts. Suffering, facing our inner demons, mindfulness of death, that kind of stuff.
Heavy stuff, right? But we've also uncovered some incredibly powerful practices for finding peace, clarity, and even joy. It's like the Buddhist teachings aren't about wallowing in misery, They're about understanding the root of suffering so we can actually break free from it.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think it's time to get a bit practical here. You've given us a great overview of this path to liberation, but for someone who's just starting out, it can feel a little overwhelming, right? Like, where do we even begin to put all this into practice?
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, but Ajahn Nyanamoli really stresses that it's not about becoming some perfectly enlightened being overnight, It's a journey, a process of gradual training.
Right, it's a path.
Exactly. And the Buddha himself often compared this path to taming a wild elephant.
Oh yeah, I love that analogy.
You wouldn't try to wrestle a wild elephant into submission all at once, would you? It takes time, patience, and a lot of skill.
Definitely not. I'd probably get trampled.
Exactly. So it's about approaching this path with that same kind of gentle persistence. It's about taking it one step at a time, one breath at a time.
Okay, that's reassuring. So where do we start? What's the first step on this path?
Well, mindfulness is really the foundation of everything.
Okay, mindfulness. We've talked about it a lot, but can you just remind us what that actually means in practice? It's more than just meditation, right?
Yeah, it's much broader than that. It's about bringing a quality of awareness to everything we do, whether we're walking, eating, working, or even just washing the dishes. It's about noticing our thoughts, feelings, and sensations without judgment, just observing them with curiosity.
So it's like hitting the pause button on autopilot and actually tuning in to what's happening in this moment.
Exactly. And when we do that, when we start paying attention, we begin to see our habitual patterns more clearly.
Like all those little things we do without even realizing it.
Yeah, exactly. We might notice the tension we're holding in our bodies, or the critical thoughts running through our minds. Or maybe we notice how we tend to react to certain people or situations. And that awareness is so powerful because it creates space for choice.
Instead of just mindlessly reacting, we can actually choose how we want to respond.
Exactly. And this all ties back to what we were discussing earlier about right view, seeing things as they truly are so we can make choices that lead to greater peace and freedom.
It's all interconnected, isn't it?
It is. And as we cultivate mindfulness, we naturally start to cultivate all these other wholesome qualities that support us on this path. Qualities like kindness, compassion, patience, generosity, and gratitude.
It's like we're building a whole toolkit for dealing with those 5 hindrances we were talking about.
Exactly. And these qualities aren't just some feel-good abstract ideas. They actually have a real impact on our lives and the lives of those around us. Kindness creates connection. Compassion helps us to ease suffering. Patience helps us to navigate difficult situations. Generosity opens our hearts. And gratitude helps us to appreciate what we have.
Wow, yeah, they create this ripple effect that spreads outwards from our own practice.
Exactly. And it highlights the fact that this path to liberation isn't a selfish pursuit at all. It's about waking up to our interconnectedness, recognizing that our actions have a real impact on everyone and everything around us.
It's about contributing to a more peaceful and compassionate world.
Exactly. And speaking of support, there's something else I wanted to mention that Ajahn Nyanamoli talks about in the book, the importance of finding a teacher or community to help guide and support you on this path.
Oh yeah, the importance of Sangha, and I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, even the Buddha himself emphasized this. He talked about the importance of good friendship, surrounding ourselves with people who inspire us to grow and support us on our journey.
That makes sense. Having a community, a Sangha, to practice with can be such a powerful support, especially when things get tough.
Absolutely. It's like having a group of experienced hikers guiding you through unfamiliar terrain. They've been there before, they know the pitfalls to avoid, and they can offer encouragement when you're feeling lost or discouraged.
And having a good teacher can be so helpful in deepening our understanding of the teachings, right? Someone who can offer personalized guidance and support.
Definitely. Finding a teacher who resonates with you and who can help tailor your practice to your specific needs can make a world of difference. A community and a teacher can really help you to stay committed to the path.
This book is full of so much wisdom, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We definitely have, but hopefully this is giving you a good taste of what Dhamma Within Reach has to offer, and I encourage everyone listening to check it out for themselves. It's a treasure trove of insights and practices that can guide you towards a life of greater peace, clarity, and the freedom.
This whole deep dive has been such a powerful reminder that the path to liberation isn't about reaching some distant goal. It's about cultivating awareness, wisdom, and compassion right here, right now, in each and every moment.
And as you continue on this journey, remember to be patient with yourself, to celebrate your successes, to learn from your mistakes, and to never give up on your quest for true peace and freedom.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dhamma Within Reach. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. And as always, if you have any sources you'd like us to explore in future deep dives, please send them our way. We're always looking for new and interesting material to dive into. Until next time, where you find peace and clarity on your path.